A conference is not a conference without a panel discussion. And this next session is going to put a big tick in that box so we can say we have delivered the full conference experience for you here at CityJS 2021. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and friends from beyond the binary, allow me to present to you not one, not two, but three amazing speakers for your entertainment, education, and general viewing delight. In the blue corner, hailing from San Francisco, USA, we have Tracy. Tracy is a serial entrepreneur, a Google developer expert, and a Microsoft MVP. In the red corner, hailing from Phoenix, USA, we have Dylan. Dylan is the head of the Living Spec startup, released the Dojo framework more years ago than he cares to remember, and until recently was the CEO of SitePen. In the yellow corner, hailing from Paris in France, we have Wassim. Wassim is a senior developer advocate with Microsoft and has contributed to more tools that you use on a day-to-day basis than I can count on one finger. Possibly two, I'm not quite sure. I'm going to be honest, that intro was probably a little bit of overkill, but hey ho, I thought with three speakers it demanded a little bit extra effort, right? Right. In this session, these folks are going to talk about something that they've not actually told us about. They're keeping their cards close to their chest, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say that it's probably about JavaScript. It's a safe bet, right folks? Anyway, I'm sure it's going to be super insightful and something that you will enjoy watching along with. If this session leaves you with any questions, please do join me for the Q&A session, which will be starting straight after this talk on GatherTown. Keep your comments coming in on social media using the hashtag CityJS2021 and those comments rolling in on whichever platform you are watching along on. It has been great to see everything you have been enjoying and absorbing throughout this conference. Without further ado, it is time to hand you over to our trio of experts for our panel discussion. Take it away, folks.
Hello, CityJS. Hope everyone's doing well. Today we're going to talk about TypeScript and the future and the present and the past. I think I'll let my fellow panelists say a few words and then we'll just get right into it.
Hey folks, I'm Wassim. Nice to be here. Hey Tracy, hey Dylan.
I'm
Welcome.
Tracy. You can follow me on Twitter at LadyLeet, and I'm excited to be here as well, talking about TypeScript. We laugh and joke about TypeScript all the time at our company. One of our team members is like, "Oh no, TypeScript again."
I often find that like you complain about TypeScript, but then if you removed it, you'd be like, "Oh no, all this awesome is gone." So
gone.
it's like,
yeah,
I know, right? I know that like, go ahead.
We joke that he must like JavaScript only and not TypeScript because he enjoys more challenges while coding. Like,
Yeah.
He enjoys debugging with no descriptions.
I love making stupid mistakes and not catching them until they're in production. That's totally my joy in life. Yeah.
Yeah.
I only write perfect code. Why would I need something to help me? So I think what we're going to do is talk a bit about where TypeScript is with recent updates, because TypeScript releases every 3 months, and like in the words of Anders, the co-creator of TypeScript, basically each release should break you in some new way. And that's kind of interesting. And I'll explain what that means. So we'll talk about some of the recent things that might break you, some of the things that are coming up, and then maybe sort of dig into why you might consider TypeScript. Maybe you looked at it a while ago and haven't tried it recently, and you have a different experience than what we have. And then maybe just talk about how the broader JavaScript ecosystem looks at TypeScript, and maybe just kind of see where we go. But we really are pretty unstructured. We kind of all just like to talk and blab on. So I think that's our plan for this panel. If you have questions, you can just meet up with me or others in GatherTown after the talk. I think that'll be the easiest way. It's got that nice video chat option. And without further ado, let's dig in. Yeah.
So TypeScript future. What's the future
Yes.
of TypeScript? Well, what's the present of TypeScript first?
Yeah, so like, you know, TypeScript releases every 3 months, and some of those releases are big, you know, some of them, but some of them are just, hey, that's what we could get done in 3 months, and now we've got a new release. And so I think TypeScript 4.0 came out last year, and it was kind of a minor release. Like, they didn't actually do that much. That's because it corresponded with summer holidays. And even though people were sort of sheltered up with COVID, I mean, they got some stuff done, but it wasn't like this big changing release that you would expect from a 4.0. It's just they don't like 3.10, so they called it 4.0, right? But 4.1 was really cool. They had this template literal type introduction thing, right? And what it did is it just kind of really changed the way you could describe type definitions for template literal strings. I mean, people were writing really crazy tools to like write, like they almost said like the template literal string stuff itself is like Turing complete in terms of what you could do with it, which is pretty funny. So that was kind of the big thing there. And I think people had way too much fun with it. But what I think is interesting is it might finally make it viable to sort of actually have a newer template format for frameworks that you can actually like validate and provide type definitions for and make sure you don't make stupid mistakes in that space.
Yep. Yeah, I remember that. It was a super interesting feature to add back then.
Yeah, I mean, people were doing like, there's like this site with just like all these obscure demos people were doing. It was pretty awesome. I think I could find it if people are curious, but I don't have it off the top of my head. And then this year in February, the 4.2 release honestly was just a lot of minor things. I think in my company's code base, we had like half a dozen things to fix, so it wasn't too bad. It took us about an hour to upgrade, so that's kind of normal. But just a lot of things where it's like, oh, you know, in this obscure scenario, we might not have been strict enough, so we found this fix for you, that kind of thing. So we just found some areas where we could refine our code base a bit and make it more TypeScript compatible. And then 4.3, which is coming up, the beta is coming out next week, I think, assuming it's on schedule, and then the final release is in May, has a feature that's been in the works for a while, which is private methods on ES classes. And that's a pretty big change or a pretty big option. So I think one of the things that the TypeScript team has done, so sort of stepping back, like TypeScript started in 2012 or 2011, and effectively they invented features that wouldn't be standardized for like 4 or 5 years. So there are things like private class fields, which TypeScript has had for years, but are only now just starting to get standardized through the TC39 process. And so one of the main things TypeScript's trying to do is not add new language features, but instead work with the standards groups to get them in place so they can leverage those. Yeah.
So you're a big fan of private fields and private methods.
Well, I think they serve their purposes for framework authors. I mean, if you're a purely functional programming person, you probably don't care, but I do think that there are scenarios where you want to make sure that, like, you know, each thing is uniquely invoked or instantiated. And I think classes are a nice way to represent that. And, you know, if you have a large API surface area, you don't necessarily want to have to like lock all of that down. Maybe parts of it are very internal and you don't want to expose that. So I think just the intention there is pretty helpful to say, well, this is like our API footprint, but then there's all this other stuff going on behind the scenes that makes it happen that is intended to be stable or, you know, promoted. And so, I mean, that's generally why I would say you want to use private stuff in TypeScript or JavaScript, even though, like, yeah, it doesn't really matter in the big scheme of things. It's more just a taste thing there, right? In terms
I do agree, yeah.
how you want to, yeah.
It's more a feature like for, as you said, for library authors and framework authors. I don't know, I'm thinking about Ben last year.
Yeah, exactly. Or, you know, if you're building an API for your startup and you want to like decide what, you know, some people are like, oh, just expose it all via GraphQL, but that might not be the right idea. You know, you might want to like actually think about what you want to support so you don't end up like, you know, bringing your service to a halt kind of thing. So, yeah. And then
I think
Go ahead,
TypeScript is
Jason.
really good for teams. I mean, I think that, you know, one big example that kind of Wassim alluded to was when Ben was rewriting RxJS, you know, during the refactor, there were bugs found that would have never been found if it wasn't for TypeScript. So that's pretty huge, especially for a library that's consumed by so many people, right? And I know,
Yeah.
I think Wasim, you were talking about you were like there when Angular was switching to TypeScript. I don't know if you have like insider info on why that decision was made and everything.
Yeah, I think if I remember well, it was during the so Angular was using AdScript before using TypeScript in the beginning, and because of I think they introduced the annotation and decorators back then. And instead of going with their own language, I think they teamed up with the TypeScript team, and they brought annotation and decorator to TypeScript and worked together with the TypeScript team to release that as a feature. And then they adopted TypeScript and found tremendous bugs in the framework back then.
Yeah.
And funnily,
yeah, AdScript was like a fork or an extension of early TypeScript, and the TypeScript team really reached out to and became friends with the Angular team and said, "Hey, let's just like have one of these, not two of these,
let's do it.
because why, you know?" And Yehuda Katz of Ember actually rushed to quickly propose a decorator syntax, which the TypeScript team embraced for TypeScript 1.5. And that's kind of controversial because like TypeScript team, just to make Angular happy that they could have this feature they relied on, rushed to implement it as it was proposed. And since then, the decorator syntax has changed a lot. So one of the things actually on the TypeScript roadmap for this year is to get TC39 with their help to finalize the decorator syntax, so then they can update again the decorator syntax. Like Babel has got various transpiler versions that will take various versions of the decorator proposal and transpile it back. It's changed enough over the past 3 or 4 years that like it's kind of a moving target. So they're hoping that it'll no longer be a moving target for how to define decorators for TypeScript and JavaScript, which is pretty cool. But like, I mean, the TypeScript team is really quite good at embracing the community. They're kind of the first, I describe as the first real open source project from Microsoft. Before that, it wasn't like they did things in the open or on GitHub or like now. Microsoft is one of the biggest contributors to open source, if not the biggest company contributing to open source out there. But when they first announced they were doing an open source project, I mean, the JavaScript ecosystem just laughed and they were like, yeah, right. Like I would trust Microsoft with my language, and oh, come on, they're just going to try and replace JavaScript again and all sorts of other negative things. And over the past 8 years, they've clearly proven that that's not their intent, which is really cool.
Well, thanks to Microsoft for that.
Yeah.
I think also there's like other examples like Just, Puppeteer, and Dojo kind of all adopting TypeScript. I mean, Vue as well, you know, you feel like a lot of companies were just waiting to adopt Vue. So that's kind of interesting. I wonder what that did to the Vue adoption graph, because they were waiting for Vue 3 to go out because Vue 3 uses TypeScript. So, you know, good decision, bad decision.
Yeah. Like every framework has faced a major rewrite at some point in their history, right? And so like for Dojo, it was 1 to 2, but also we had a 0.4 to 1.0 major rewrite. So we've kind of done that whole thing twice. React had it when ES6 was finalized, they had a big rewrite. Pretty much everyone had to do a major rewrite when ES6 was finalized. And that's kind of what led Angular down the TypeScript path and what led Dojo down the TypeScript path. And Vue kind of was after that. So they kind of started out as an ES6 framework, and then they decided that they really needed the support of what TypeScript offers for themselves. So they've really tried to say you can just use Vue 3 as a JavaScript developer, which I think has got pros and cons for saying that. Anyway, I could talk forever on this topic, but let you all talk too. Yeah.
I know, Wasim, you had some opinions, I guess, on should Vue have switched to
Um,
TypeScript and what are the trade-offs for that?
so disclaimer, I'm not a Vue user or developer myself, but yeah, as an external folk to the community. So one of the things I like about Vue is it's JavaScript. JavaScript framework, like literally you can just drop it on the browser and it just run. You don't have this extra build step that other frameworks have. And I think that was one of the major, I guess, probably major reason why folks adopted Vue instead of migrating from Angular JS. Instead of going to React or Angular, they went to Vue because it has some kind of similar paradigms and developer experience, I would say. My concern right now is like having TypeScript, which is a good decision by the way, but just having this extra build step would probably I have how do I say this? These blocker
I
for
mean, I
for
think,
some users, but that's my opinion.
yeah. I mean, I assume that's why Evan came out with Fight to try to make the build step really fast and easy for Vue
Yeah.
and other projects. But I think everyone's kind of like, there's this classic problem of you want to start with something simple and easy to adopt, but then your users push it in ways you never expected, right? So like Vue was like, hey, it's a templating language. It's like HTML plus. You start out, if you're an HTML or CSS person, it should feel very familiar. And suddenly, 2 years later, you're writing like massive amounts of JavaScript code to just do what you want it to do, and you realize it's like difficult to maintain, right? And so I think whenever a framework tries to like naturally progresses to being used for larger and larger applications, you have this tension of like, how do I keep it simple and yet support the needs of all of our users? And I think people are building ambitious applications with Vue, and they probably need the tooling that TypeScript provides to make that possible. So I don't know how you'd get around it other than like try to make the build process simpler and faster and easier.
Yep.
But
That's actually a great transition because this brings up to the question that why teams should consider TypeScript. So you mentioned like when your app grows and becomes more complex, and you need to maintain it, you need to make sure it's maintainable at least. So
yeah,
yeah, we've been discussing this earlier, and um, we had some opinions about that, I guess. So probably Tracy or Dylan want to start. So why teams should consider TypeScript? And then we probably ask the other question: why should teams not consider TypeScript?
yeah, it's so I'll share a dark secret about myself that I probably shouldn't share publicly about. I actually hate writing tests, and I'm supposed to love writing tests because I'm like a framework author and I should care about my users and all of these reasons that tests are important, right? But I'm generally the person who like makes someone else on the team write tests, and it's because I feel like it's tedious. And some have argued, well, writing type definitions is tedious also. And I'm like, well, yeah, in that case, you can just put in any type there and come back later and fix it, which is kind of a cop out. But the reason I mention this is we all have, it's not a binary decision, right? It's not like I must be a full TypeScript purist and a full test driven developer or zero. I don't write tests and I don't write type definitions. And I don't care about this stuff, right? But why does TypeScript matter to me? It's interfaces. It's like an interface is a form of a type definition. I've said this for years, right? But it's like JavaScript lacks interfaces. And you're writing code to be shared among others. The first thing you ask is, well, what's the API? And JavaScript doesn't have a definition language built in that describes what's my API footprint. And so TypeScript interfaces are a way to describe what's the expected API that users should have access to. And for me, that plus like catching a classic set of like type mismatch errors and inaccurate code and like incorrect invocation of functions and methods and stuff like that, that to me is like compelling enough that, yeah, like I'll write definitions and I'll write interfaces. But if it gets crazy or out of control, then I have to ask myself, okay, is it my code that's wrong or is TypeScript, wrong? And then I kind of like step back and try to be pragmatic about it. But I'm really pragmatic about what I write and how I use TypeScript and how I write tests and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's totally right.
I think for me, the reason why I like to recommend TypeScript generally is because I feel like it creates more like a more inclusive environment. And by that I mean with TypeScript, it's much easier. I feel like for junior developers and people who may not be senior or understand the code base, to be able to understand the code base quicker, it kind of provides those guardrails. So you can kind of, reason about your app a little bit better, understand the functionality a little bit better, um, less bugs, right? Um,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, and like, I really do love the better error handling. Like, I can't tell you, I mean, I'm not into, I mean, who's into errors, right? But being able to spot the root of the problem easier is
Yep.
like a godsend, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, like,
a valid point. Like,
and if you were an early TypeScript user, the error messaging was not great, but they put a lot of effort into making errors that make sense now, so you can find them. And it's funny, like years ago, I used to do a lot of Dojo workshops back in the 1.x days, and it would be a lot of people who transitioned from other programming languages who were used to autocomplete in a browser. And they'd be like, where's the autocomplete for Dojo? And I'm like, you don't need autocomplete. And they'd be like, well, there's 1,400 modules. I'm like, yeah, you just memorize them all. And I was sort of joking, right? But like, there was no like, hey, I can just start to type the function name and I get the function name and I get the call signature and it fills it in, right? And so just having like, but what's cool also is TypeScript can do some of that for plain JavaScript now. Whereas before it was like, you just got to like fully embrace this thing or else you don't get this benefit. So it's like this moving spectrum of like how accurate autocomplete can be for you. So you don't have to memorize all the methods and functions and properties and objects and everything in your code base.
yeah, totally. That's a good point about JavaScript, because you could, I mean, well, obviously TypeScript is just JavaScript with some types. So if you're considering using TypeScript and doing like a migration from JavaScript to TypeScript code base, enabling the checking JavaScript code is very important, and you could do it like gradually,
incrementally. Yeah.
Incrementally, yeah. Thank you. Not going whole like big bang migration, as we say.
Yeah.
With that flag.
And early on, that was a problem with TypeScript. Like that was not possible until around TypeScript 2.0 when they enabled the check.js features. And it was an early argument for why you would use Flow instead of TypeScript and that sort of thing. But yeah, like it doesn't have to, like people think, oh, it's a new language. No, actually, it's a type checker and a syntax validator and an interface describer for JavaScript. And most of it is tooling, and a small bit of it is extra syntax or grammar to the language. But most of it is actually the tooling behind it, the TypeScript language services, the error handling, the checking, the support for IDEs, but very little of it is actually new grammar to learn. So if you're a JavaScript developer and you look at TypeScript, it really is not much to learn until you could get into some very esoteric stuff quickly, I guess. But for the most part, it should feel readable at least. You might not know like, why these like 50 levels of generics exist in this file to like smooth over your API or something like that. But other than that, like it should feel pretty straightforward for most JavaScript developers, I think.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's also kind of interesting because, I look at my career in JavaScript and, I started off with a framework, right? I started off with Ember back in 2015 or so. And, then moved to Angular. But like for me, if there's not a CLI and a framework, I'm not into it. And it's much harder for me, right? I think a lot of developers as well. And I'm so used to using TypeScript now. And so for me, I'm more comfortable in TypeScript than I am in JavaScript. And, is that okay? Right?
Yeah.
Like, are we going to get to the point where people only know TypeScript, they don't know JavaScript? And again, I know it's the same, but not at the same time, right? It's almost like TypeScript is that kind of like framework in a sense that if I didn't have it, I definitely would not be as happy and feel as comfortable.
There's just like I was wondering actually, how would it be like working on like a project written entirely in JavaScript, but then checked with TypeScript with the the special flag? How would that be? I've never done that. Like most of the projects I work on are TypeScript. So would TypeScript compiler be able to check your JavaScript even if it doesn't have explicit typing? because otherwise, TypeScript is going to infer the typing from your code. But how clever?
Yeah, it's pretty clever. Like it can't figure out things that don't make sense, but it can also point out things that it can't figure out. So it's pretty helpful. I mean, I would just try it sometime, but it's pretty straightforward and is useful. And again, like you can choose the level of, I think if I remember correctly, you can choose like the level of what you want it to check and how strict you want it to check.
Yep.
And things like that. But like, I think it's interesting, Tracy, because when I look at TypeScript, I still think of it as JavaScript code. Like I still think of it as like, so a few years ago, an engineer had joined our team and I'd worked with him before and he had not used ES6 or TypeScript before. And he spent a day working with it. He's like, I hate all this TypeScript stuff. I'm like, oh, okay, what do you hate? And he's like, well, like I hate this spread operator and I hate this like, these arrow functions. And I'm like, well, so actually you hate ES6. He's like, what? What do you mean? And I'm like, well, those are all JavaScript features that are new to the language that you just haven't used before. They're not TypeScript that you hate. And he's like, oh, and like, I mean, obviously that was kind of a classic like 2016 problem when people hadn't done much with ES6 yet. And so, and then it was like his mood changed completely. He was like, oh, okay, I'm not like learning this new strange thing. I'm just adding a little bit more to it. But the tooling is really nice. I actually think you probably spend more time with the tooling than the actual like deviation of language features. And a lot of the things that TypeScript added early on are now, they've probably changed a little bit and now been standardized. And so now even more of what TypeScript provides is part of the standard compared to 5 years ago. So like back in the day, modules weren't finalized. TypeScript had their own sort of module approach. Now you pretty much just use ES modules all over the place and that sort of thing.
Yep. Yeah, and that's an interesting point you mentioned, Dylan, is that I've heard some folks saying that TypeScript is like wasn't initially aligned with the TC39, all the JavaScript specifications. They were introducing their own API, and basically it was like a how to say this, a JavaScript fork. But I think that changed. I mean, recently. I mean, since
I can add to that if you want.
I mean, yeah.
So I mean,
you worked on that.
The thing is, TC39 was something completely new in like 2009 or so. There was this Harmony proposal, and before that, there was really no agreement on standards, and really it was a battle between 3 browser vendors or 4 browser vendors at the time who didn't really agree. And there was this big ES4 push, right, which never shipped, thankfully, because it was basically turning JavaScript into something more like ActionScript or Java. But a lot of the concepts actually are there now. It's just they hadn't figured out how to make them feel JavaScript in nature. And so what you realize is anyone who worked on JavaScript from like 1996 to like 2014 didn't believe the standards process worked. So if you were to create something on JavaScript, you would. I mean, ES6 was something you had no idea if it would ever ship, to be fair, because it had been in the works for so long, but also it was a moving target. So if you thought in 2011, hey, we'll look at the TC39 process and pull in what they're doing, and you ship it, by the time ES6 came out 4 years later, it had drastically changed. So even if they were aligned with an earlier, proposal, it just didn't end up that way. So of course they deviated, but then around 2016, I think they joined, the TypeScript team has a member who joined the TC39 working group and became part of the process. And they basically at some point said, we're after decorators, I think, because they said, we're not going to introduce any more new language features that JavaScript is considering, right? So if JavaScript is thinking of adding a new operator or a new feature or whatever, we'll be an early adopter of it. Once it reaches like stage 2 or stage 3, we'll get an implementation in place. But they're not going to intentionally introduce new stuff unless it's just completely outside the realm of what TC39 wants to consider, and also basically something that is essential, right? They don't want to deviate from the language, but they had no choice given the time they started. Yeah, I think so a lot of their updates are removing old stuff that doesn't matter anymore. Right. It's just kind of fun.
And that's something super important to mention. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, another thing for me, like why should the team adopt TypeScript is, as you all mentioned, like code navigation, understanding the code base. It's also the developer experience, like the tooling, the language server, the browser, the code editors integration, the CLI as well, the compiler, all of this,
Yeah.
and also the ecosystem. I know that some teams from the community have implemented like code migration and code modes to help you migrate your JavaScript to TypeScript.
Yeah.
All
Yeah.
the TS-lint, all the checkers, all the AST
Code generators, like all the stuff. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
even like Apollo, the GraphQL framework, like helps you generate your TypeScript types from your schemas. This is super
Yeah.
awesome.
It was funny. It was like, I think it was 2018. It was a Christmas break or winter break, and my Twitter stream was alive with people who normally had hated TypeScript who all decided to try it that break, and they all liked it now. And this was sometime between like 2.0 and 3.0. And suddenly TypeScript went from this thing that just people like me liked to people like everyone else liked. And I was like, oh, this is really strange, because now it's like the world is realizing there's benefits. And so people were like, oh my gosh, what's this refactoring feature in an IDE? I've never seen this before. And like a lot of JavaScript developers, they learn things their way, and that no other programming language could possibly have a good source of inspiration. And I'm somewhat joking, but I know people like that. Like when JavaScript's your first programming language, there's a lot of things that, at least back in the day, you wouldn't have known you were missing because you'd never experienced them. You'd never seen what a refactor button could do to clean up your code. You'd never noticed that, like, well, I don't have to rename this thing 50 times. I can just rename it once and it'll like, no, I can clean it up in all the right places and stuff like that. So it's kind of funny to sort of have people have that experience for the first time, whereas like I did dabble in enough other languages to have that perspective, but a lot of people don't, and it's kind of cool to see these things gain traction. And I think it's important to remember that like TypeScript, if it's weird, it's because JavaScript's weird. Like the things about TypeScript that are kind of strange are the result of trying to create a type system and type checking system and code tools for the language as it is, rather than trying to change the language itself.
Which you can't.
Right.
Yeah, once you ship something in JavaScript, it's there forever.
Yep.
Double equals.
Space Jam website, that's the classic example, right?
Exactly. And yeah, one of the issues folks report as well, and this is part of like they're saying like I hate TypeScript because the ecosystem, the npm dependencies which don't ship with type definitions, type declarations. I think it's getting better and better nowadays. And I think there's also a proposal somewhere to enhance that, to make it better.
Yeah, there's something on the roadmap for this year. I haven't looked at it, but yeah, it's on there. I think there's sort of different stages of ergonomics of TypeScript as a framework maintainer or author, right? There's the I don't care, so I don't provide any definitions. There's the I've done the bare minimum to make it possible so people stop complaining at me. There's the, okay, I've done a pretty good job and this feels pretty natural for me as a framework maintainer, but might be kind of painful for my users. And then there's the, oh, I've like thought through how a TypeScript user is going to use my APIs and tried to make the definitions as simple as possible, so that like early in the days of Angular 2 and 4, there were some things that were pretty tedious to describe with TypeScript. It worked great for the framework authors, but it wasn't yet great for the end users, that kind of thing. And really that only happens if you've used like the framework you're building and the type definitions you have and built real products with it. And so it takes time to really smooth out those ergonomics and see where there's too much boilerplate or too much cruft or just too much pain to do things that should be easy. I think the TypeScript team has helped a lot with that too. And go ahead, Tracy.
No, I was just going to, I was just thinking about like all this generally ecosystem adoption of TypeScript. And then I look at, I feel like a few years ago, we were like, oh, who's going to win, right? Angular, React, or Vue, are kind of, been the top three. And it's so interesting to watch the React ecosystem grow, because I feel like because things are built on top of React, it's almost like React becomes the de facto choice. I feel like a lot of developers are thinking about when they think about JavaScript, they think React, right? So you look at things like Redwood JS and Blitz, right? Like they're saying, hey,
or Next.js, or yeah, exactly.
right, like
Yeah.
and they're basically saying like, well, I mean, for Blitz and Redwood, they're like, this is a full stack framework for you, right? And
Mhm.
React is the de facto. But then
Yeah.
I look at, React and TypeScript, and I know we had conversations about like, just like React and TypeScript just being more difficult generally to use. And I wonder if like the TypeScript team has considered that, right? Because it's almost like should it be a priority to make TypeScript easier with
They
React?
have done a lot of work on that over the past 5 years. I think almost every TypeScript release mentions some way they've improved React's ergonomics with TypeScript. And oh, thank you. Yes, and as a someone who's so I'm like Dojo co-creator by my startup. We're building a big scale app with React and TypeScript. It's fine. Like there are things that are imperfect, but it's really not TypeScript for the TypeScript React ergonomics that get in the way. It's just that React has had a lot of changes and churn over the years, and there's no one right way to do things, and TypeScript can't really fix that. But I don't think it's as big of a problem unless you you need to start out thinking, hey, I'm going to build a TypeScript app with React, because then you sort of start out with the boilerplate and templates to do that, I think. But maybe it would be cool if React was authored in TypeScript, but it's not. But I think same with, so the TypeScript team has spent a lot of time with Angular, React, and Svelte to help them deliver a better experience for users. Dojo, I think, just kind of told the TypeScript team what they needed to get fixed, and those things were fixed early on. And Vue, I think, didn't really need much help either, because the TypeScript came kind of late with that rewrite. So I don't think it's as big of a problem as you might expect with React, but I also want to say that at one point in time, you could have said the same thing about jQuery. Like jQuery's got this insurmountable lead and no one will ever stop using it, and things change. But what's cool about React is the patterns and JSX, but you could swap it out and you could use Preact, or you could use Dojo, which also supports JSX. There's probably 50 other projects that support JSX syntax. If the React core doesn't continue to be useful, but what's cool about React is actually not that core. It's all the stuff that people have built on top of it. And it's hard to compete with really strong community support for things. So, but I don't want anyone to win that battle is kind of my point. So, yeah.
There's choice for everyone.
Yep, exactly. It's we have 2 minutes left.
Yeah.
Maybe we could each describe one wish we have for just the bigger web ecosystem and close it out with that, if we have one. Yeah, one wish.
I'm always excited about just more education around this. So I would encourage people who are learning TypeScript to also just write about it, because everybody's perspective is so different in terms of how they learn. And that really helps people generally adopt TypeScript. So, and also share it with your teams, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, one thing to add to that, Tracy, is I don't know if folks know that the TypeScript team has recently released a handbook, which is free to download. I'll tweet about it later on my Twitter. So it's free. Go get it, and yeah, have fun with learning TypeScript.
Yeah. My wish is generally that people realize that technology enables us to create things. It's not the thing to force us to go to battle or defend a framework decision to the death. It's not a sports team to cheer for. It's not your identity. It is a thing that helps you create other things. And so it doesn't matter what framework you use or what tool you use, but find the things that work for you and embrace them and create crazy cool stuff with them. That's my wish for the ecosystem.
Make the planet a better world.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it sounds idealistic, but it's totally true.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Oh. Awesome.
Thanks, everyone.
Well, thanks, everyone.
Yep.
Yeah, we're all on Twitter. So definitely you can find me on Twitter at Lady Leet. Wassim has his already.
Manikiniko.
I should have added it.
And I'm Dylan S. Just really cryptic. Yeah.
Thank you, CDJS, for having
Thanks,
us.
everyone. I'll be next to the stage in Gathered Town. And I don't know if you two are joining or not, but I'll be off to the side somewhere.
I'll hang around for
Cool.
5
Or you can
minutes.
just click my name and follow me. Yeah, and stalk me. Cool. Thanks, everyone.
Dylan Tracie Wassim, thank you very much for that amazing panel discussion. Very, very enlightening discussion it was too. Now, with 3 speakers in one session, it's only fair that the audience at home puts in 3 times the amount of effort into our round the world round of applause. 3 different directions. Do you see what I did there? Okay. Now, if that discussion has left you with more questions than answers, please do join us for the Q&A session over on GatherTown any moment now. If you're not on GatherTown, not a problem. Don't forget, you can post along on Twitter using the hashtag CityJS2021, as well as get involved in the comment section on YouTube. We really do enjoy hearing what you think about all of our talks and speakers throughout the day.